Entering in. You are here and you have chosen to be. Breathe through the words and venture into the world as I see it, holding both love and gratitude as a guide. When you feel the tension, it is okay to walk away, but let the book remain open. This is your heart speaking. We will not agree, and this is not the point. The point is that we listen, even when difficult, watching the weight of it all not tear us apart, but instead open us into ourselves and one another to co-create and share. We must first hear. While this book is my mouth open, when the time is right, you should speak. I will never know who you are unless you tell me. You will never know who you are unless you let the tension be. I am from a punch and a kiss. Both pain and beauty have made me.
Marlanda.
Matt.
Hi.
Hello. Hello.
Welcome to the Contributorverse podcast.
Thank you.
I'm so happy you're here in my home. It's so good to see you.
And the same here. Same here. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
So to give listeners a little context, what are you doing in Charleston? Why are we being graced by your presence right now?
I have the honor of being in Charleston for the Free Verse Poetry Festival
Awesome.
with Marcus Amaker and I believe the city of Charleston working together. Okay.
Yeah. Office of Cultural Affairs.
There's a lot
all
of
these long people with long titles.
Yeah.
And
It's like a big sponsor. Like there's a group sponsoring thing.
Yeah.
And so I'm here to do a feature tonight. I'm here in town to do a feature at Frothy Beard. I'm excited. I'm gonna share some poems.
Yeah, cool. Have you done a poetry reading at a brewery before? That's the real question I want to ask.
I have not. I have not, but I love breweries, right?
Well, there you go.
So I found it funny that it was being held in a brewery.
Yeah.
Because I often, read or use a brewery as office space. I do that a lot. And so to be reading poems in a brewery sounded quite appropriate.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to start off on like a very sincere note of gratitude for you just dropping by and talking to me today. I know you had like a heck of a time getting here, and you literally just came off the road. So thank you. And you have a show later tonight, so I know. Thank you for just your time. I really appreciate that. Yeah. And I was also thinking earlier today when I was getting ready for you to come here, I was really thinking that like talking to someone like you is just exactly why I wanted to do this podcast, because you're someone that every time I see what you're doing on social media, I'm just like, yes, love it, like it. I always feel like we're on a really similar wavelength in a lot of ways. But how often do we get to see each other?
Not very often at all.
Right. And here we are, we're in the same state, and that's true of so many good writer friends I know. Yeah. We support each other, we love each other from a distance, and when we do get to see each other, it's usually at events and readings, and we're like, hey, how's it going? What's up? See you later. Mm-hmm. And the thing I have loved so much about doing this podcast is just the opportunity to really talk with creatives that I love. Yeah. Yeah. Because it's such a rare thing, sadly, So I'm really looking forward to catching up, and I've been looking forward to this and diving into your book, which I've had for a while. I kind of reread it today, so we're just going to get all into the life of Sapient Soul.
Let's do it.
Yeah. So just for people listening, I know that self-definition is always a tricky thing. Okay. And it's always transforming. Mm-hmm. But how do you define yourself just today? What's the definition of Marlanda today? Who are you?
Yeah. I think today Marlanda is a poet. I think what you're getting at is kind of the different hats I've worn.
That's a part of it.
That's a part of it.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. I wanted you to answer it however you wanted to answer it. So that's the thing.
I find myself kind of pulling away from any other title than poet, so that I can remember poet. And so lately I've been, I'll stand in the mirror, poet, and literally do that.
Wow.
Before I do anything. And so I think The reason why I've been doing that strange practice is to make sure that I remember poet. So I would say poet. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Why has that been something hard that's to remember for you?
Yeah. So in, let's say, 2013, Spoken Word Spartanburg started up, and in that work we were organizing poetry events throughout the city, and then we started doing something that was called Poetry and Conversation. And so that was exactly what it says. Poets would come in, they would share poems, and then dialogue would happen around the poems. And then that space took a life of its own, and we founded the organization as Speaking Down Barriers.
Yeah.
And so I love what the organization stands for in the sense of really facing into some of the most painful aspects of human existence for the sake of beauty and life and transformation. But I think I lost poet in there somewhere. I've written the whole time. I've shared poems the whole time. But even when I look at the poems that I've shared while working with Speaking Down Barriers, there's a way, and I still work with Speaking Down Barriers, but there's a way in which I began to allow my poems to be contorted to hope that they would communicate a specific message to reach a specific person, more so than communicating what my soul needed to get out through a poem.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why I'm still an administrator, I'm still those things, but I gotta be poet first or I'm not any good at those things. And you know, I think it's probably been some pretty generous conversations I've had with loved ones. It's been conversations in therapy to get to that, to you know, this is really who I am, and I gotta hold on to that.
So where did the poet begin? Like when was the poet born in you?
Yeah, I've been writing, Matt, since I was probably 6. I think
awesome.
As old as I could write and realize that you can make stories and you know, something could happen to me in a day and I could just write it down, that I started doing that. Now, my mom, I will say, she realized very early on that when I got very stressed out, or I was a very intense child, and I can still be a pretty intense person, and I was bullied a lot, and so I'd come home and I would bully my sisters, my younger sisters, and she had this way of telling me to just go to the page. She would just redirect me to writing.
Was writing in your mom's life at all, or is it just because she noticed?
No, my mother is not. My father is a writer. My mother is not. And even my father, you know, he's a closeted writer. It's not something that she would really, I don't think she would make that connection. I think she just knew there was something she saw in me.
Well, it got you quiet.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sometimes, I'm not a parent, but I imagine sometimes your parenting goals are just pretty basic.
Get them in that room and get them quiet. And that could have been it, but that's what led me to the page over and over again.
We were talking kind of right before we started recording that you said that recently your favorite writing topic has been rocks.
Yes.
And we laughed about that because I think so I was thinking, you know, we met very much in the poetry slam world.
Yes.
And I think we've both, in similar and probably also different ways, moved, you know, I don't want to say beyond that, but moved into different areas.
Yeah.
And I think both try to explore things that, you know, maybe are difficult to get across on the slam stage, for instance.
Yeah.
Like a poem about rocks.
Right.
Would be like if you went to a slam coach and was like, yo, I have a fire poem. It's going to get a 30. It's about rocks. Yeah. They'd be like, you know, no.
Probably not.
Probably not. Mm-hmm. So why rocks? What's been new in your writing?
Yeah.
That's been exciting for you?
Why rocks? So they're really, I guess the more appropriate term would be crystals that people use now.
Yeah.
And I found myself, so my girlfriend is an herbalist, and in her training, she went through some training with stone healing, crystal healing and stone healing.
Yeah.
And myself, I've lived with depression and anxiety, and so I'm very open to alternative treatments whenever they present themselves. And so we sat down and I just found myself amazed by the colors. I'm like, something this orange came out of the earth, something this pink, something this purple. And then I started to remember that growing up, I collected rocks. I don't know where the memory went, but I did. I just had the memory come, and I'm like, oh, I collected rocks all the time, and I would look at the little fossils in the rocks of the bugs and chop them away somewhere. And so there is this connection, I think, through youth to now that has to do with rocks. But I really think I started writing about the rocks just to get my head out of writing about oppression, writing about injustice, and to get me to look at the beauty of life again. Yeah. Because it's always present, even when the injustice is present. And I found myself, I was in a space where I could see the injustice much more clearly than I could see what was beautiful about life. And so I think the earth and spending time in nature and outside and digging, we've gone, mining for our own crystals and just getting into the dirt. It's been very, it's been life-giving. And I know there's jokes all around out there that's like, yeah, these rocks, what do these rocks do? And I love the jokes. I think they're great jokes. But when I put a piece of selenite on my forehead, you can't tell me anything. I feel better.
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel a whole lot better. And so I think writing about it has been me stepping into something unfamiliar even to myself. Like to explore it with whoever reads it, whoever hears it. Because it's not anything I've ever written before to write like that.
Well, one of the things that I was really excited with talking to you about, and this is, I think, a good segue, is like, you're someone who's definitely, and I feel like I'm a similar way, trying to figure out ways to make the world a better place, but come at it from a place that begins within. Mm-hmm. Because, I very much was like a college activist kind of person and was kind of came up in that world of, organizing and, social justice protests and rallies. Mm-hmm. But I also, like, right at that same time in my life was getting into, like, meditation and yoga. And I remember, like, trying to find the bridge points between those two worlds, and struggling for like a long time, but I think there's so much power and truth to be found, and there's a lot of, on the other hand, a lot of danger when the two are disconnected, because there's a lot of work done in the name of activism that comes from some really unhealed places within people, and there's a lot of ego in movements. There's a lot of ego in the art world, obviously, too. There's ego everywhere, but I love talking with people. Like, I had a friend of mine, Allison Scher, on the show recently, and she wrote a book called The Millennial's Guide to Changing the World. And Alice and I met back in those college days, and we had that kind of same thing. We were trying to, like, integrate, like, how do you make the world a better place with, like, how do you be your best in a way that, you're like, now an effective servant for others, instead of just working out of your guilt or working out of your pain or all that mess. Dealing with your inner mess before you try to clean up the world mess.
Right. Yeah.
I guess a good place to start. what kind of came first? Did you start looking sort of outward at the problems of the world, or did you look inward first, or did it all kind of happen at once, you know?
Yeah, so I'm hearing some friends in my head, I think. So let me answer for myself.
Okay. That's the rule on this podcast. You answer for yourself.
Answer for myself. So I'd like to say that when all this, when my work started with looking at injustice in the world and how do we make the world a better place, I'd like to say that it started from within. But when I look back, I think it's because I've looked back that I'm able to see that because I was seeing things that were happening, and then also some things that had happened to me directly. And then taking those experiences and not using them to create a space, but that can be the start. That can be the start to something, right? Your experience can be the start to something. What you see can be the start to something, but it doesn't need to stay. It doesn't need to be where you stay.
Yeah.
And so I think I would say it started with me seeing things on the outside that didn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
And that's how even poetry has evolved for me over time. It's always been to make sense of something, to ask questions, to dig into the questions, to make attention not be attention anymore somehow.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when I think about activism, my fear is that out of our pain we will perpetuate more pain. And my fear has been that even as a nonprofit director who's working to address these types of divisions with a team, we often sit down and we're intentionally doing this work on each other, and then going out to do the work, trying to keep a balance there.
Yeah.
But what I've found is that what I think I see, and I think James Baldwin talked about this too in much better words, but just the way that injustice, oppression, white supremacy, whatever you want to call it, the way it morphs to stay alive. And so then we have to constantly morph and be aware of how a thing that may be well-intentioned may not be the thing that we may be after.
Yeah.
And I think you can do all the self-work in the world, and I'm not sure that you can get rid of those blind spots with self-work, with your own inner work. But I do think inner work and deep community can help with blind spots like that.
Yeah.
And so I have a strong group of people around me that I can get pretty jaded about things, and they're the right group because I can even get jaded and confused about them because I'm so confused about what I'm seeing in the world, and they're like, wait, you're doing that thing again, remember?
Right.
And so I think the more we have that, I just don't think we change anything outside. I think we need more of that before anything changes outside.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I know one of the programs you do with Speaking Down Barriers, you do, I know you all do a variety of things, but two of the groups I believe you run are, and I might be jumbling up the names, but like one is geared towards black folks and one is geared towards white, right? It's healing us
and learning us.
Learning us, yes. Right? And I thought that was so fascinating because when I was at College Charleston, I was a part of some really cool kind of experimental dialogues around race and gender and a lot of these issues. And I remember that always being kind of a controversial thing. Like we would maybe come together as a very multicultural group, and then it was, they might kind of split us up, where like the white students go in one room to have a discussion over there, and then black students would go, or students of color would go in another room. And I I think I always remember the white students were usually a lot more uncomfortable with the idea of being split up and having to talk with other white people.
Yes.
Like I remember like that came up quite a bit, but I think that is a really useful. It's two different kinds of work because it's perhaps two different sets of blind spots that have to be handled really differently. Yes. Like, I mean, I know just thinking about the types of ego shit we can bring into movement work and activism work, like for a lot of white folks, or maybe men trying to be involved in doing anti-sexism work, like there can obviously be motivations out of like guilt, you know, and like white guilt and shame or embarrassment about your society. And those are not always, like, that's good if that gets you in the door. Yeah. But if that's your operating system for the next 5 years of trying to be helpful in society, like that's gonna be trouble. Yeah. You know? So what does that work look like for someone who is like speaking down barriers? What is this in these discussions? So how do y'all do this work of bringing people together, and particularly those two groups? Like, what was some of the thought process behind that?
Yeah, so we didn't start that way. We started with everybody coming into the same space. And what we found was that people of color would come and feel burdened with, it wasn't enough to share the story. A lot of the responses would be, well, no, that couldn't have happened. Or things like that. Just, and I think if we looked at any dialogue anywhere, we would see some of these patterns. But what we wanted to do is break that pattern. Yeah. And so what we saw was this isn't going to be effective if people are coming into the room and feeling that they're put into the hot seat to explain what's happened to them. Even though that, you know, we could ask a question like, what is racism? And it still end up with someone feeling like they need to prove what racism is and that it has happened to them.
Or prove that I'm not racist.
Or prove that I'm not racist. Yeah. That's right. And so you have these, we're not really good about having the same language on how to talk about race. And so when I heard about racial affinity groups, I think it was through Ruth King's work. She is a Buddhist, I think Zen Buddhist, and what she does with her work is she does race work, but it's based in Zen Buddhism.
Very cool.
Yeah, and
I've heard of similar things. I don't know that name, but
another would be and I think they would have different approaches. But another individual would be Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams.
I'm familiar with her.
Okay, Radical Dharma. Yeah. And so they both talk about these racial affinity spaces. Spaces where you can say the thing that's probably the most uncomfortable thing to say. You can drop the thing that you would never say that really needs to be worked on. You can deal with the guilt. You can deal with the shit that's in the way of you doing the real work. And so that's what learning us was for white folks to come and do. And so what we did in that space was we used poems, literature as a place to kind of jump from. So we might read something from James Baldwin. And I'm saying we, but I was not in that space. So it was being facilitated by two white facilitators. But they would basically go into a writing process interacting with James Baldwin or interacting with Pauli Murray. And allowing that to open them up. What we found though, because we are actually restructuring both programs. We've stopped them as of July. Okay. And we may come back to opening them. But the reason why we stopped them was, one, there was a decline in attendance that we paid attention to. But even bigger than that, I think that folks were really ready to be out doing something. And we would get that feedback a lot. When are we going to do something? When are we going to do something? And our work is very much set in, who are you before you go do? And that can be really frustrating.
But so needed.
It's
like,
so needed, but it frustrates people, Matt. It
Yeah.
really frustrates people. Because there's so much happening, especially right now. Especially right now, I think people feel in imminent danger. And they don't feel that talking will fix that. And I can respect that.
Sure.
I can respect that. I just wish that we could see that it's not talking, that it is truly, at least for me, in my own life, the things that I've been unable to understand in someone else's life, my own life, before I even came out, I was homophobic. I'm a recovering homophobic who is in love with a woman. So that all had to do with breaking down barriers within myself, you know? Yeah. And if I was not willing to go in to figure out who I am, if I wasn't willing, I don't know who who I'd be.
I mean, I totally hear that criticism too. That like,
yeah,
what are we doing? Just talking, writing poems about, you know, like, changing the world. But I do think there are deeper layers to a lot of these questions that don't necessarily get solved simply in the voting booth or at a rally. There's just some of this shit is way more complex. I'm so glad you brought up James Baldwin, because I'm a huge James Baldwin fan. Yeah. I had a really amazing professor in college. Her name was Consuelo Francis. She was kind of a local legend at the campus, and
I know that name.
She unfortunately passed like fairly young. It was incredibly sad, and she was just she was like my mom in Charleston practically. I love this woman to death. But she was basically the college's kind of main African-American literature guru, really. And I remember she was a huge James Baldwin fan, and as soon as I found that out, I was like, okay, I'm reading everything James Baldwin ever wrote. And there is a line of his from The Fire Next Time that has been fucking with me for like 15 years, because I think it's so deep. I think it gets so much to the heart of this, but it's really like, with racism, it's a very counterintuitive thought, and I want to get your thoughts on this.
Okay, I'm excited.
He said, and this is, I think, towards the end of The Fire Next Time, he says, white people have quite enough to do in learning how to accept and love themselves and each other. And when they have achieved this, which will not be tomorrow and may very well be never, then racism, or what he says the Negro problem, will no longer exist, for it will no longer be needed. And I remember like reading that line and being like, that doesn't make sense, James Baldwin. How can the solution to white supremacy be white people accepting and loving themselves and each other? That doesn't make sense, James Baldwin. And yet it actually makes all the sense in the world. Like, why would you need to invent a mythology that denigrates the humanity of other people unless you secretly were concerned about you being inferior and you not being good enough? Like, it sometimes makes me feel like that term, like white supremacy, or let's say like male supremacy, are almost a little deceptive, because it suggests that it comes from a place of strength.
You're right.
And like confidence, and that the reason that men are sexist is because we are men and we are powerful, when actually dive into the psyche of a real chauvinist man, you will find a little boy who is feeling weak and disempowered and gets off, abusing women to make himself feel better. Right. It's hard to get into this like in a protest speech.
Yeah.
Or or like a protest poem sometimes. There's some, I just, as I get older and I think about how like I can contribute to some of these conversations creatively and all this stuff, for me, it's just the roots just go down way, way deep. And it's just so hard to get to those deep roots through arguing with someone on Facebook,
Yeah.
or all these kind of
Yeah.
superficial ways that we all kind of have latched onto right now, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
So I just love the kind of just deep, soulful activism work that I see you like aiming for. And I know it's not always pretty, and it's not always, people aren't always on board, but I think those are where the deep answers are, you know?
Yeah.
I went on a rant there, and I
no,
didn't
you're
really let you talk.
No, you're fine. I'm still thinking about it. I'm trying to think how to frame. I said something recently to someone, and I left that conversation a little bit afraid about what I had said, because I didn't want it to be too much. But it was a statement a little bit like that one, where I just said that I was afraid for white people, was how I said it. And that I was learning to let go of that fear in a way that controlled my actions. Because I think out of some, I don't know if it's some sort of a compassion. I really don't know where it comes from. And I say it that way because it goes so deep.
Yeah.
And so I often, even when I sit with myself very long, I'm not always clear as to what my motivations are, because they sometimes can feel ancestral. They can feel like they're beyond me. And so, but there's some poems I've written, and I'll go back to the poem, and I'm like, I did not write that. And I know that may sound crazy, but I'm like, that's someone else's pain coming through me. But I need to share this story. So I found whenever I said that, when I said that I wasn't afraid in that way anymore, meaning that I can't control what individuals choose to believe. I can't control what people's, the illusions of safety are. And I think I have spent a lot of time not trying to control it, but trying to provide a space that somehow manipulated or somehow said there is another way. There's another way, without reminding myself of the fact that I myself don't want to dominate someone else, to force them to be ready to think any particular thought, Yeah. And so now I guess when I hear this quote now, I remember reading it, and I remember when I read it, I thought, that's so sad. I remember I read it in The Fire Next Time, and I thought, that's so sad. And when I listened to James Baldwin's speeches, and when he just says, I'm not the problem, I don't have a problem. You have the problem. Yeah. And until you face that, you will have it. And he would say he's not the victim. And spending time there has been very healthy for me. Reminding myself I'm not the victim, that I've experienced, I've been victimized, right? Like I've been pulled over at 16 with a gun, by a police officer. I've experienced these things, but I don't need to drive around terrified every time I drive. But I understand why I might feel that way sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have to be well. And so I think James Baldwin saying that is remembering he had to be well and give the problem back to who it belonged to. And that's a practice for me, is giving it back so that I can be well and do what my work is.
And I think it gets to this idea that like it will actually require like white people learning how to be genuinely well, and men learning how to be genuinely well, not successful in the ways we normally think of success in American culture. But I think I got an essay published about 2 weeks ago kind of on what masculinity is all about right now, and that's such a huge piece of it for me, is like there's a lot of men that need some like deep healing, but that's a hard thing to talk about, again, because it's like it seems to be coming from toxic masculinity seems to be coming from this excess of strong masculinity, but from in my eyes, just from my own experience as a man, I think it entirely comes from a weakness and a lack of wellness. When you have like a disease of the soul, like that for me is where oppression comes from. You know, it doesn't come from like a strength. I don't think. You know,
but I think we're taught to. I think some of our languaging, like you said before, is supremacy. Like we're taught to see it as the person in charge, or the person that is in power, the person that, and this is a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, almost like comic book talk. I don't know. I don't know. We view it in a very interesting way.
Yeah.
That almost simplifies it to our detriment. I think. Yeah.
So I know I wanted to talk about spirituality a little bit with you, and I know it's already kind of come up, like you know, you kind of turning to Buddhist teachers, for instance, for a framework for how to do this work. What has been your spiritual journey, and how has that interacted with the writer, the poet, the activist? But how do you connect with the sacred and the divine?
Yeah. For me, I'm a pretty quiet person. More so than I think I thought. I spent a lot of time in solitude and not really realizing that I am. And in that time, it's a space that's created. I would say it's creating a space for me to go into, to see myself as clearly as I can. But my writing happens there too. So it's I can't say that writing has ever been separate from what's sacred for me. When I
agree 100%.
Yeah,
yes,
when I was a religious person, like I wouldn't identify myself as a religious person. I wouldn't say that I'm a Christian. I'd say that my foundation is in Christianity. Like those are the roots I touch.
Yeah.
But at any point of my journey, whether it was in church or at someone else's, backyard party under the moon, writing's been involved.
Yeah.
And I find that that's when I feel the most like myself. It's when I feel the most me. It's when I feel the most grounded. And so for me, it is a grounding in itself is a spiritual practice for me.
Yeah.
Writing is.
Yeah.
And so I think in my work with Speaking Down Barriers and working with artist clients, I find that being able to touch the part of me that's the poet that writes for the spiritual connectedness is huge. More than I even thought. Because I'll know if I miss time. You know, if I miss some of that time, I am fully aware that I need to go sit down and get quiet. So meditation is important for me. Sitting outside in the trees is important for me. Almost being covered, immersed in trees.
Yeah.
I like to be, I like to almost get into the earth. And it's weird. I don't want my feet to get in though. I don't know why I do that, but I want to get like as covered by the trees as I can.
Yeah.
And there's something about that grounds me to get me ready for anything else that there is for me to do.
Yeah.
And I feel like that is something beyond me that I'm tapping into.
Are there so I know you've kind of referenced Christianity a little bit, Buddhism. I know those are kind of two traditions. Do you feel like you still actively kind of draw from Christianity, like in your current spiritual life? Is that, and how does Buddhism fit into that, or other traditions? How do you kind of navigate that? And being a Southerner too,
right? Yeah.
And family expectations, because that's something I've struggled with. Like I got into Buddhism in particular, like in college, and I was raised Southern Baptist, and I went from like Southern Baptist to atheist to Buddhist to now I'm just, I like to think I'm in a place where I can kind of draw from the best of any tradition I come across, and I can honor them all equally, including Christianity, even though I had some trauma around that as a kid. How do you navigate some of those waters of tradition?
It's not been an easy journey for me at all. My grandfather was a well-celebrated AME minister. And so to step outside of that in a family that's in a public eye is can be kind of strange. And what are you doing exactly over there? And so I think Thich Nhat Hanh, Scott Neely, my colleague and friend, introduced me to Thich Nhat Hanh. Yeah. And his book, I think it's Living Buddha, Living Christ.
I know that book.
That book helped me to kind of, I don't know, do some swiveling. It was it's like I was swiveling around. And I was like, oh, I can, it helped me to expand my thinking around what my experience had been in growing up in a Christian household with a Christian grandfather there was a lot of trauma connected to that grandfather. And so I knew I had to find something, because I've always been someone that was drawn very deeply to connect here. And so reading that helped, and also just research into African spirituality. And I'm really slow with it, and I take my time with it because there's so much. There's so much in African mythology and in African spirituality that's been a little bit muddled, and it's kind of spread out all over the place, and which I think makes sense for when you think about just colonialism and things like that. But in piecing those things together, I have found something very beautiful. It's as if my whole life I've been practicing aspects of certain West African religions or West African ways of life that I've never been exposed to. And how would you say? No one took me to go meet it. I just did it, and then I learned about it later. And so even that's been it's been a little bit of an eerie journey for me. I just follow the signs. I don't know. One weird story I can think is being at a flea market and seeing a symbol. It's an Adinkra symbol. It's from Ghana, and it's Janame, which means the supremacy of God. And I had the tattoo here. And so I'm trying to buy this at the flea market. The guy said he got it off of a missions trip, and I got it from him. And then I go and do this ancestry test, and I find out that most of my ancestry is from Ghana, but like 87% of it, which is like a pretty high percentage. So like that type of stuff. So I just, it's a big part of, I don't know if I answered your question. I just kind of rambled away.
No, that's a beautiful answer. Yeah.
I think things find you, you find things, but it's in you anyway.
I really had to do a lot of that kind of some healing work around just my relationship to Christianity. I mean, there's definitely been times when like I wanted nothing to do with it, and I just wanted to erase it from my memory. And I'm finally getting to the point where like I can pick up the Bible and actually like, wow, there's actually some real wisdom in here, and I try to remember that like I'm named after one of the apostles, like this is with me, like there's some things we carry with us that are deeper than just, ourselves. And one I don't know if you kind of know the work of Carl Jung at all, as a psychologist. He came up with the idea of like the collective unconscious. This idea that that like we carry like really deep symbols within us, and they pop up in our dreams, and we are, whether we know it or not, we're carrying a lot of spiritual images like inside of us, and you never know like what might awaken. You know, you never know
Absolutely.
what might pop up in your dreams, and or at a flea market.
Yeah.
You know, and
Yeah.
like and show you your path in a way that you never predicted. Like I just think that's so fascinating. Absolutely.
I do too, and I think when you bring up Carl Jung, I think about mysticism, and I have a joy in the world of mysticism.
Yeah,
Like
me too.
just digging in, and I just think there's so many brilliant minds that have come before us,
Yeah.
and I love to dig in the stuff that they've left behind.
Who are some people you look at
Yeah,
in those traditions?
Let's see. So, I like to listen to Alan Watts. Yeah, I like to listen to Alan Watts.
I love Alan Watts so much. I'm really just trying to be Alan Watts by the time I grow up.
Just
You know?
trying to be.
Yeah.
I love Alice Walker. I
Yeah.
could just look at her talk. Even
Yeah.
when she gets on the little trails, I love the trails. I'm trying. Who else? Audre Lorde, I'll play just all the time. And the same with James Baldwin. I like to just have them playing.
Yeah.
But those voices, I think, while they might not have used the word collective unconscious, their writings, their essays, their speeches were all talking about that. I mean, we're all digging into collective consciousness, how it is that, I mean, it was just all digging into that stuff.
Yeah.
And so when I read, what's the name of that book? I can't remember. There's a novel by Alice Walker where she actually has Carl Jung in the novel. It's not his name in the novel, but it's him.
Really?
Yeah. And so there's some things that she's bringing out in regards to race and their difference, because he's treating a woman who's from Africa who has gone through genital mutilation by choice and in order to be still considered a woman in her tribe in Africa. And he is treating her, yes. But what he finds, or at least in Alice Walker's book, and I love how she did this, because it kind of goes back to this James Baldwin quote, this quote. But there's a part where he finds that he says, you would think to have someone this troubled in my home that I would be driven mad. But it is as if having this, I can't remember how he referred to a black woman in there, but it is as if having this dark person, this black person in my home is somehow healing me. And that I need to understand. And so Alice Walker, a lot of her work explores Jungian concepts. And so I found that fascinating because we hear a lot about how, just how we can, without meaning to, we can seek to heal ourselves through others. And so sometimes you can have a whole group of people seeking to heal themselves through a completely other group of people. And I like all that stuff. I can get lost in it. I love it. Yeah.
Well, I don't want to keep you too long because I know you got a show to get to in a little while. Let's just end on a note of the future. What are you you got any projects in the works, or just some directions you feel like you're heading in?
Yeah.
What do you think 2019 might look like for you?
Yeah.
What do you want it to look like?
What I want it to look like, I want to travel. I want to do some international traveling.
Ghana.
I know. That would be great. That would be great. I want to go to Ghana. I want to go to Paris. I want to sit where James Baldwin sat. You know, I want to do some of that. I want to write there. I know it's going to be a different chair by now, but you know. I am also working on the books. You know, the things about rocks. I don't know what that'll turn into. So there's this title in my mind that is just fun for me right now. It's just fun, and so the title in my head that I kind of joke around with is "Earth for a Poet Rocks," and just saying that over and over. Earth for a Poet Rocks, And again, that in itself is grounding for me, because there are some times where Earth for this poet does not rock, and I'm looking for somewhere else to go, and I need to be here as long as I'm supposed to be. So I think working on that and traveling is what I want to see in 2019. And with Speaking Down Barriers, I want to see that space begin to, rather than, we've done a lot of work on getting people to sit down and talk to one another. And what we're about to get into is almost more so of a being that community. So it's not that you're coming into this guided program with these particular questions. There may be questions, but maybe there's a showcase and there's food, and we're just being together across these differences. Maybe we're practicing the thing that they say is against the law. What was it yesterday, that transgender folks are supposed to no longer exist, right? So maybe we say that that's tomfoolery, and we go do it anyway, you know? So, and that's what's happening, you know, right now in Greenville. They're organizing a whole event, name changes and everything, to make sure that folks who identify as transgender are situated in their identity before anything else is to happen.
Before any laws might change.
Yeah, and so when I think about those things, I think more spaces for free, just people to be free, loving people. And I mean love in a not a cheap way. I mean it in a very strong, daring way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I felt a lot of love right here.
Good.
I think we're doing it, you know. Thank you so much for talking today. This was a lot of fun.
Well, thank you.
You know,
thank you.
And we should do this more often.
We should.
You have an open invitation.
All right, I will take you up on that.
We need to start seeing each other more than once a year for 5 minutes.
I agree.
All right?
I agree. Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt.